December 16, 1944, dawn crept reluctantly over the frozen Ardennes, casting pale light across a forest that seemed suspended in time. Snow clung to the branches like silence itself, and the cold cut through uniforms, through skin, through thought. For many American soldiers stationed in this sector, the war had felt distant here, muted, almost merciful. It was a place where battle-worn units came to recover, to breathe, to believe that perhaps the worst was already behind them. But that illusion was about to shatter in a way no one could have imagined. At first, it wasn't even clear what was happening. A distant rumble low, almost indistinguishable from the groaning of the winter wind, began to build. Then came the unmistakable thunder of artillery, not scattered or hesitant, but coordinated, relentless. The German army had launched what history would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge, a massive, desperate gamble to split Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. It was bold, it was risky, and in those first hours, it was devastatingly effective. American defenses faltered under the sudden weight of the assault. Units that had expected quiet patrols instead found themselves overwhelmed. Communication lines broke, orders became confused, then contradictory. Entire formations were forced into retreat before they even understood the scale of the attack. Snow-covered roads clogged with vehicles, men shouting over the chaos, officers scrambling to restore control. The Germans, hardened and determined, surged forward with alarming precision, exploiting every weakness they could find. Near the town of Monchaux, however, something began to unfold that even seasoned soldiers couldn't quite comprehend. German troops advancing through the dense forest moved cautiously, their instincts sharpened by years of war. They knew artillery, they understood its rhythm, the whistle, the impact, the brief moment to breathe before the next barrage. They braced themselves as the familiar sound returned, echoing through the trees. But what followed broke every expectation they had ever relied on. The shells didn't land, they detonated above them. In an instant, the forest transformed into a storm of steel. Shrapnel rained down with terrifying velocity, slicing through branches, tearing through helmets, ripping into bodies. Men who had survived countless battles dropped where they stood, cut down before they could even react. Others threw themselves to the ground, seeking cover behind trees or shallow trenches, only to realize, too late, that there was no protection from an enemy that attacked from the sky itself. And worse still, they had no idea how it was happening. Panic spread quickly, commands were shouted, ignored, lost in the chaos. The very instincts that had kept these soldiers alive, duck, cover, wait for impact, were suddenly useless. There was no safe direction, no predictable pattern. The explosions came at just the right height, maximizing devastation, turning the forest canopy into a deadly amplifier of destruction. It wasn't just artillery anymore, it was something else entirely. Something that seemed to anticipate their movements, as if the shells themselves knew exactly where to strike. For the American forces, the effect was immediate, but even they didn't fully understand what they were witnessing. They saw the results: advancing enemy units abruptly halted, formations shattered mid-march, attacks collapsing before they could gain momentum. It was effective, undeniably so. Yet behind that effectiveness lay a secret so tightly guarded that even many of the men deploying it had no idea what made it different, only that it worked. And as the day wore on, one unsettling truth began to take hold among those on the receiving end. The battlefield had changed, not gradually, not predictably, but in a single, terrifying moment, because now, death didn't just come from the front lines or the horizon. It could come from above, without warning and without escape. Before we uncover how this terrifying new weapon came to be and the man who made the decision to unleash it, make sure to subscribe and like the video. It helps bring powerful, lesser-known stories like this to more people, ensuring these moments in history are never forgotten. Not far from the chaos engulfing the Ardennes, an American officer stood at the center of a decision that would ripple far beyond the battlefield. Colonel Oscar Axelson wasn't witnessing the war from a distance, he was inside it, watching as the German offensive gained momentum with alarming speed. Reports flooded in, units retreating, positions overrun, defensive lines bending dangerously close to collapse. He understood the gravity of the moment, but what he was about to do would place him in direct conflict with orders from the highest levels of command. Axelson had access to something most officers didn't. Locked away under strict authorization was a new kind of artillery ammunition, experimental, highly classified, and surrounded by layers of secrecy. It wasn't meant for situations like this. In fact, it wasn't meant to be used against ground forces at all. High command feared the consequences. If even one unexploded shell fell into enemy hands, its secrets could be reverse engineered. The risk wasn't just tactical, it was strategic, potentially altering the balance of the entire war. But Axelson could already see that the balance was shifting anyway. He studied the reports again. German forces were advancing in coordinated formations, exploiting weak points with precision. Conventional artillery was slowing them, but not stopping them. The situation demanded something more, something decisive. And deep down, Axelson knew that what he had locked away might be the only thing capable of turning the tide. Even if using it meant disobeying direct orders, risking court-martial, and possibly handing the enemy a weapon they could one day use against them. The choice wasn't theoretical anymore, it was immediate and irreversible. So Axelson made his decision without requesting permission. Without waiting for approval, he gave the order, use the shells. At first, nothing seemed different. The artillery units followed the command, loading the unfamiliar rounds with the same practiced efficiency they had used countless times before. Coordinates were calculated, angles adjusted, fuses set, or so they thought. Then the guns fired, sending the shells arcing into the cold Ardennes sky. For a brief moment, everything appeared routine, until the shells reached their targets. What happened next stunned everyone who witnessed it. German troops advancing across open ground were suddenly struck by explosions that didn't behave like anything they had encountered before. The blast erupted above them, perfectly timed, unleashing a deadly cascade of shrapnel that tore through their ranks. Soldiers who had expected to take cover from ground impacts found themselves exposed, vulnerable in ways they had never trained for. Trenches, foxholes, even dense forest cover, none of it provided safety anymore. And the realization spread through their lines with chilling speed. Entire formations faltered mid-advance. Commands broke down as confusion took hold. Some soldiers froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. Others attempted to retreat, only to be caught in overlapping bursts of steel raining from above. The battlefield became disorienting, almost surreal, a place where the rules of survival no longer applied, where instinct betrayed you, and where every step forward could be your last. For Axelson, the results were undeniable. The German advance slowed. Then it staggered, and in some sectors, it stopped completely. But as effective as the weapon was, Axelson understood the weight of what he had done. There was no undoing this decision. The moment those shells detonated over enemy troops, the secret was no longer contained. Whether the Germans recovered fragments or simply observed the effects, the existence of this technology was now exposed. And if they understood even a fraction of it, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet in that moment, standing amid the reports of halted advances and shattered enemy lines, Axelson also knew something else. If he hadn't acted, there might not have been a line left to defend. And somewhere, far from the battlefield, the minds that had created this weapon had no idea that their invention had just been unleashed in one of the most critical moments of the war, changing everything in an instant. Long before the frozen forests of the Ardennes turned into a storm of falling steel, the true origins of this weapon lay thousands of miles away in quiet laboratories, far removed from the sound of gunfire. It was there, in the United States, that a group of scientists had been grappling with a question that seemed almost impossible. Could a weapon be made to decide when to strike? The idea sounded almost like science fiction at the time. And yet, the answer they were closing in on would soon redefine the battlefield in ways no one could fully predict. At the center of this effort was Merle Tuve, a physicist with both vision and urgency. Alongside him worked a small but brilliant team, including James Van Allen, a name that would later become synonymous with space exploration. But in 1944, their focus was not the cosmos, it was survival. The Allies needed an edge, something that could outpace the rapid, brutal evolution of modern warfare. And what they were building had the potential to do exactly that, if it worked. Their challenge was immense. Artillery shells endured extreme conditions, violent acceleration, intense, crushing, forces that would destroy most delicate instruments instantly. Yet the team's goal required placing something incredibly sensitive inside those shells, a miniature radar system. It had to be small enough to fit, strong enough to survive being fired, and precise enough to detect the ground below while traveling at high speed. If it failed by even a fraction of a second, the entire concept would collapse. But against all odds, they succeeded. Inside each shell was a tiny electronic system capable of emitting radio waves and detecting their reflection from the below. As the shell descended, the signal would change, allowing the device to determine its height with astonishing accuracy. And at the exact moment when the shell reached its optimal position, high enough to maximize impact, low enough to ensure precision, it would trigger the explosion automatically. A breakthrough so advanced that even many military leaders struggled to fully grasp its implications. The project was shrouded in secrecy so intense it rivaled even the Manhattan Project. Thousands of workers contributed to its development and production, yet only a select few understood what they were truly building. Entire facilities operated under strict security, components manufactured in separate locations to prevent any single point of failure or discovery. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a technological gamble, one that required absolute secrecy to succeed. Because if the enemy learned how it worked, they might find a way to counter it. By late 1944, production had reached remarkable levels. Hundreds of thousands of these shells were being manufactured, each one a small marvel of engineering. And yet, despite their readiness, their use remained restricted. Military command feared exactly what Axelson had risked, that if even one intact shell fell into German hands, the advantage could be lost. So they waited, holding back a weapon that could change the course of battles. Until the battlefield itself forced their hand. When reports began to arrive from the Ardennes, accounts of German advances being halted by explosions that defied conventional explanation, that quickly made their way up the chain of command. Among those who received them was Dwight D. Eisenhower. He read the reports carefully, weighing not just their immediate impact, but their broader implications. What he saw was clear: a weapon once considered too risky to deploy had already proven its value in one of the most critical moments of the war. And withholding it any longer might cost far more than revealing it. The decision came swiftly, the restrictions were lifted. It would be deployed across the entire front. And just like that, what had begun as a guarded experiment became a defining force on the battlefield, shifting the balance in ways the enemy could neither predict nor counter, at least not yet. If you're finding this story as fascinating as it is pivotal, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps bring these hidden chapters of history to light, reaching more people who might never otherwise hear them. Because as this technology spread, its impact would soon be felt in one of the most intense and desperate battles of the entire offensive, a place where surrounded soldiers would stand their ground against overwhelming odds, and where this invisible breakthrough would prove the difference between collapse and survival. As the German offensive carved deep into a lot, one location emerged as the entire battle: Bastogne. It was, on the surface, an unremarkable town, small, quiet, easily overlooked. But beneath that simplicity lay its true importance. Bastogne was a critical crossroads. Whoever controlled it controlled the flow of the battle itself. And by late December 1944, Bastogne was completely surrounded. Inside the encirclement stood the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units thrown together in the chaos of the German advance. They were cut off from supplies, short on ammunition, and exposed to the relentless cold. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the in white while temperatures dropped to punishing lows. Medical supplies ran thin, food was rationed. And yet, despite everything, they held their positions because retreat was no longer an option. The Germans tightened their grip, launching repeated assaults to break the. From their perspective, it was only a matter of time. Surrounded, weakened, and outnumbered, the American defenders should have collapsed. But something unexpected awaited them each time they advanced across the open fields surrounding the town. Something they still didn't fully understand, and something that was about to turn Bastogne into one of the most legendary stands of the war. When German units moved forward, expecting to overwhelm the sky answered first. Artillery shells burst overhead with terrifying precision. The explosions came not in scattered impacts, but in calculated waves, each detonation time to maximize destruction. Shrapnel rained down across the snow-covered fields, cutting through advancing formations before they could even reach engagement range. Soldiers who had prepared for machine gun fire or entrenched defenses instead found themselves caught in a lethal storm from above. And once again, there was nowhere to hide. Attacks that might have broken the line under normal circumstances simply dissolved. Momentum vanished, coordination faltered, units that had advanced with confidence were forced into retreat, their numbers shattered by a weapon they couldn't counter. The Bastogne wasn't just being defended, it was being transformed into a killing ground, where every approach carried the risk of sudden, devastating annihilation. And with each failed assault, the pressure on the German offensive grew heavier. On December 22nd, confident that the situation was hopeless for the defenders, German command issued a demand for surrender. It was delivered with certainty, almost expectation. Surrounded forces, freezing temperatures, dwindling supplies, what else could the outcome be? The message reached Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the American forces in Bastogne. His reply was a single word, nuts. It was brief, it was defiant. And it carried a message far beyond its simplicity. Bastogne would not fall, no matter the cost. The fighting continued with renewed intensity. Units like the 969th Field Artillery Battalion played a crucial role, maintaining a relentless barrage that turned the surrounding terrain into a barrier of fire and steel. Every German advance was met with resistance not just from determined infantry, but from an invisible force that struck from above, disrupting every to regain momentum. And slowly, decisively, the tide began to shift. To the south, George S. Patton maneuvered his forces with remarkable speed, pivoting the Third Army northward in a bold attempt to relieve the. In one instance, German troops attempting a river crossing found themselves exposed at the worst possible moment. Artillery far precise, devastating caught them mid-movement. The result was catastrophic. They never made it across. And with each failed operation, the German offensive lost strength it could not replace. The Battle of the Bulge would become Germany's last great offensive in the West, and it would fail. Not because of a single turning point, not because of one, but because of many moments like these, decisions made under pressure, innovations deployed at just the right time, and soldiers who refused to yield even when surrounded. Yet in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, something deeper had changed. War itself had evolved. It was no longer defined solely by numbers, by bravery, or even by position on the map. It had become a contest of innovation, of who could adapt faster, who could think beyond established limits, who could transform an idea into a decisive advantage on the battlefield. The proximity, few silent, unseen, and devastating, was more than just a weapon. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare, a future where technology would shape outcomes as much as strategy, and where the most dangerous threats would not always be visible. Because for those who faced it, the most terrifying enemy was the one they couldn't even see.